Since the outbreak of Syria's conflict in 2011, the country's northeast has stood apart from the authority of Damascus, evolving into one of the most complex political and military theatres of the war. Over more than a decade, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, established de facto control over vast areas stretching from Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor to al-Hasaka. Supported militarily and politically by the United States as the primary ground force against Islamic State, the SDF built parallel governing institutions, managed security, oversaw detention camps for thousands of ISIS fighters and their families, and controlled much of Syria's most valuable oil and gas infrastructure. What emerged was not an internationally recognized state, but an autonomous administration that functioned independently of Damascus and shaped daily life for millions of residents. This arrangement was always fragile. The Syrian government never abandoned its claim to full sovereignty, and regional actors, particularly Turkey, regarded the Kurdish-led forces as an extension of militant groups it considers a direct threat. The balance endured largely because of the US military presence and the shared objective of defeating ISIS. However, with the territorial defeat of the extremist group by 2019 and shifting international priorities in the Middle East, the foundations of Kurdish autonomy began to erode. The political transition in Damascus in late 2024, which brought President Ahmed al-Sharaa to power, further accelerated efforts to reassert central control over long-lost territories. In early January 2026, these tensions erupted into open confrontation. Syrian government forces launched a rapid offensive against SDF-held positions, initially in Aleppo province before advancing eastward. The clashes marked one of the most intense episodes of fighting between the two sides since the civil war began. Government troops, supported by allied tribal fighters and security units, seized key towns and infrastructure, including major transport routes, dams, and energy installations. Particularly significant was the capture of vital oil and gas fields in Deir ez-Zor, assets that had provided the SDF with both revenue and political leverage for years. As government forces pushed deeper into the northeast, the military balance shifted decisively. Faced with mounting losses and the prospect of prolonged urban warfare that would devastate civilian areas, negotiations accelerated. By mid-January, Damascus announced that it had reached a comprehensive ceasefire agreement with the SDF. The truce halted fighting across all fronts, bringing an abrupt end to days of clashes and opening the door to a political and security realignment that few would have predicted even months earlier. Under the terms of the ceasefire, hostilities ceased immediately, and SDF forces began withdrawing from several contested areas. The Syrian government moved swiftly to deploy troops and administrative officials into cities and towns previously governed by Kurdish-led authorities. The agreement provided for the transfer of control over border crossings, oil and gas fields, and major infrastructure to Damascus, effectively dismantling the economic and administrative foundations of the autonomous region. For the first time in over a decade, the Syrian state regained direct authority over most of the northeast. Rather than ordering a wholesale dissolution of the SDF, the agreement outlined a process for integrating its fighters and personnel into Syrian state institutions. Individual members would be vetted and absorbed into the army, internal security forces, or civilian administration. This approach aimed to prevent a sudden security vacuum and reduce the risk of armed resistance or fragmentation among former SDF ranks. It also reflected Damascus's desire to present the takeover not as conquest, but as national reunification. A particularly sensitive component of the deal involved the fate of prisons and camps holding ISIS detainees. Control over these facilities was transferred to the Syrian government, shifting responsibility for one of the region's most volatile security challenges. The move raised questions about long-term counter-terrorism cooperation, accountability, and the handling of foreign fighters, whose home countries have often been reluctant to repatriate them. In a bid to reassure Kurdish communities, the government coupled its military and administrative takeover with political gestures. Officials promised expanded cultural rights, recognition of Kurdish language and identity, and the resolution of long-standing citizenship issues affecting stateless Kurds. National recognition of Kurdish cultural celebrations was also floated as part of a broader narrative of inclusivity under the new leadership. While these assurances were welcomed by some, others viewed them cautiously, recalling decades of marginalization and unfulfilled promises. For the SDF leadership, agreeing to the truce was shaped by a convergence of military, political, and international pressures. The rapid loss of territory and resources weakened their negotiating position, while internal divisions and grievances among Arab communities in SDF-controlled areas further undermined cohesion. In regions such as Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, resentment toward Kurdish-dominated administration had simmered for years, making it easier for Damascus to present itself as a restoring authority rather than an occupying force. International dynamics also played a decisive role. The United States, while urging restraint and supporting the ceasefire, appeared unwilling to escalate militarily to defend Kurdish autonomy. This reflected broader shifts in US policy and a reduced appetite for prolonged entanglement in Syria's internal conflicts. SDF leader Mazloum Abdi publicly framed the agreement as a necessary step to prevent further bloodshed, emphasizing the need to protect civilians even at the cost of political concessions. For Damascus, the ceasefire and subsequent takeover represent one of the most significant strategic victories since the early years of the war. Regaining control over the northeast not only restores territorial integrity, but also secures access to critical natural resources that are essential for economic recovery. Politically, it strengthens the government's claim to legitimacy and sovereignty, reinforcing its position in regional and international diplomacy. The implications extend far beyond Syria's borders. Turkey has welcomed the weakening of Kurdish military power along its frontier, viewing the developments as a reduction of a long-standing security threat. The reintegration of the northeast into Syrian state structures aligns with Ankara's preference for a centralized authority over any form of Kurdish autonomy. Meanwhile, the United States and European actors face difficult questions about future engagement, sanctions, and humanitarian support in areas now firmly under Damascus's control. Humanitarian concerns remain pressing. The recent fighting displaced thousands of civilians, adding to an already immense population of internally displaced people. While the ceasefire has allowed some families to begin returning home, large-scale reconstruction is a daunting challenge. Infrastructure across the northeast has suffered years of neglect and war damage, and Syria's battered economy, compounded by international sanctions, limits the government's ability to deliver rapid improvements in living conditions. Minority rights and political inclusion remain another source of uncertainty. Many Kurds fear that without constitutional guarantees, promises of cultural recognition may prove symbolic rather than transformative. Trust between Kurdish communities and the central government is thin, shaped by decades of repression and the abrupt end of hard-won autonomy. Whether Damascus can translate rhetoric into durable policy will be a critical test of the post-ceasefire order. Security risks also persist. The integration of former SDF fighters into state forces carries the potential for friction, especially if issues of rank, pay and loyalty are mishandled. The management of ISIS detainees poses ongoing threats, as any lapse in security could fuel a resurgence of extremist violence not only in Syria but across the region. Despite these challenges, the truce marks a decisive turning point. It ends an era in which northeastern Syria functioned as a quasi-independent entity, and brings the country closer to territorial reunification than at any point since the war began. Whether this moment becomes the foundation for lasting stability or merely a pause before renewed tensions will depend on the implementation of agreements, the inclusiveness of governance, and the willingness of all sides to prioritize reconciliation over coercion. The government's takeover of Syria's northeast following the SDF truce is therefore both an ending and a beginning. It closes a chapter defined by fragmentation and competing authorities, while opening a new phase filled with opportunity and risk. The coming months will reveal whether this fragile calm can evolve into sustainable peace, or whether unresolved grievances and regional rivalries will once again plunge the region into uncertainty.